Yo, what's good, Time Clan? It is your boy King Time next here, back with another video, and you guys already know the deal. Well, this is going to be my very first Mushoku Tensei with it, but before we actually do begin with the video and the intro, of course, I would just like to say I have a Patreon, so if you guys are interested in further supporting me, you can head down to the link in the description. I also have a Discord as well, but when it comes on to the perks of Patreon, you'll see it as well. When it comes on to Discord, you guys can probably suggest more ideas there as well. But enough of the talking. You guys aren't really here to hear all that. You guys are here for the video, so let's roll our intro. Now, when Rudeus was first conceived, he wouldn't be confused as to what exactly was happening. You see, the very first thing that Rudeus saw when he first came into this brand new world, this brand new whimsical world, was, well, two adults hovering above him for some reason. One, oh wow, she was a looker. You see, she was a beautiful woman. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. The other, on the other hand, okay, that guy looked kind of fierce. He looked like a fierce warrior of a man. He seemed unusual to say the very least. He seemed to have a sort of strict looking face, you could say. He also had silver hair and, well, he had some sort of golden brown skin, you could say as well. That wasn't the unusual part about all of it. Well, maybe the hair, but then again, there was a good chance the guy probably just dyed his hair that color. The unusual part about this guy, though, was the fact that he noticed a pair of wings, black wings to be specific, poking out from behind his back, and they looked kind of real. Was he trying to cosplay a fallen angel or something? If so, he was doing a very good job at it. One question led to another, though, with the fact the man suddenly began to speak in a foreign language. It was a language that Rudeus had never heard of before. The woman began to speak in a dialect that was completely unfamiliar to him as well. It seemed as if they were speaking the same language. This further confused Rudeus, wondering what was the whole deal with this. What was the whole deal with his situation at hand? He would try to raise his hands out, only to see that they were small and stubby. He would be confused, wondering how did he revert to being a baby. He was trying to remember the last thing that happened to him before he found himself in whatever sort of situation this was, but the last thing that Rudeus could remember was him trying to protect some teenagers from getting hit by a car. His eyes would widen, realizing that he would have realized right at this moment what this meant. Him being a baby again, his last memories being of him basically dying. It couldn't be. He was actually reincarnated. He never thought this to ever be such a possibility. As a matter of fact, he never really put that much thought into what would happen to him when he died, in all honesty. But he had to admit one thing, though, and him being reincarnated was probably one of the things that he would have least expected. It would have been one of the last things that Rudeus would have expected if he were to ever die, but sure enough, that was exactly what happened. And he supposedly had no choice but to accept this new reality of his, learn about the differences in this world compared to his original own. The very first thing that Rudeus had to learn was this whole language, because he refused to just be in this world listening to people basically say gibberish his whole life. And he still had the mind of an adult. So it wasn't going to simply be him acting as if he would just grow into it. No, he would actually have to put in a good amount of time and effort in order to learn this language. So he would spend time learning a couple of things about the language. It sounded like gibberish at first, but while he was deciphering the language, he would eventually get the hang of it. He would begin to understand what each of the words were saying, what his parents were saying as well. And Rudeus would also learn a couple of things about this new family of his, especially when it came on to what exactly they were. For you see, Rudeus ended up finding out that although his mother was human, his father actually came from an entirely different race, which explained the wings. His father, Paul Greyrat, he actually came from some race by the name of Lunarians? He didn't really understand the name at first, but he would end up getting some more clarification during his, bedtime stories from his father. Those bedtime stories will actually consist of Paul basically telling Rudeus about the legacy of their race, how strong, the Lunarian race was. They were apparently known for being able to survive in pretty much any sort of environment, having incredible strength, and boasting a great amount of durability as well. But the part that really stuck out to Rudeus though was the ability to harness fire and the ability to fly that was mentioned in each of these stories. Rudeus wanted to learn how to do these. Just being able to fly on its own already sounded rather enticing to Rudeus. It sounded as if there were races with certain perks to them, and Rudeus seemed to have gotten a rather interesting race. The fact that he could fly, or potentially fly, was already a bonus. And the fact that he could harness fire, that he had a natural affinity to using fire as well, already meant that Rudeus was going to have a great amount of potential in the future, or at least he hoped that was the case. This world also seemed to be based around magic from his understanding so far. He wasn't sure whether or not each race had an affinity for a certain type of magic though. When it came on to his father's race, the Lunarians, and from the stories that he was given, it seemed as if they had an affinity for, fire magic. He wasn't quite sure about other races though. That was the thing that he was trying to figure out. He wanted to learn more about each other individual races within this world because of the fact that he doubted that there was only the human race and the Lunarian race. It sounded kind of left field just to have there be one race, regular humans, and then you just have another race who just looked similar to humans except for the fact that they had wings and their hair was silver rather than any other color. Even Rudeus's hair was silver, and he had, his hair, what am I saying here? Basically, his hair was silver, and when it came onto his skin, it was a light brown, you could say. Basically tan, essentially. His skin tone was tan because of his mother's genetics running in there as well. Basically being something to play with. But he did not know necessarily. He did ask his dad a couple of questions before about there being any other races in the world, which his father would actually give him some confirmation to. Yeah, there were plenty of different races within their world. He probably wasn't going to meet all of them, but, maybe he could. Just because there was a probability that he wasn't, at least at this age anyways, and why not go out and explore? Why not try and test the limits? Why not try and search for all of these different races? Although there were a couple that he doubted that Rudeus would want to actually meet one day, considering the history behind them. Rudeus didn't really know what his father meant when he was talking about history. Now this meant that there was even more to these different races within the world than he had just once thought. Did this mean that there was some bad blood between some of them? If so, what sort of bad blood? Was there some sort of culture that he had to understand? All of these questions were just spinning around Rudeus's mind at that moment, just from those couple of words that his dad had said one night. It was one of the things that he just couldn't get his mind off of. The other thing that he couldn't get his mind off of, though, was his, innate ability to fly. Or, I shouldn't say innate, more so his potential to fly. He was trying to push his dad to teach him how to fly every day. How to fly and manipulate fire. These two things just excited Rudeus so many times. But each and every time, his father, Paul, would just simply refuse to teach him. He would always say that Rudeus was just too young for him to wait until he was older. But Rudeus, he was a pretty impatient child. That, and he still had a mind of probably like a 40-year-old. But while trying to learn my language, while trying to learn more about the languages spoken in this world, Rudeus would end up coming across some sort of magical book. He would grin mischievously before heading up to his attic, where he would actually practice using the magic in secret. Rudeus was half Lunarian. He was half Lunarian, so he questioned whether or not he was limited to only using fire magic. After all, he had seen his father use fire magic before, but that was the main thing he ever seemed to use. That and fighting with the sword, but that wasn't really magic. He would decide to test out this theory of his, the fact that he was only part Lunarian, and he also had some human blood in him as well. Did that mean that he had access to more magic, more potential magic? He would eventually try this out by doing a simple spell. This simple spell would, of course, be him simply using water magic. He would have attempted to create a water ball, and he would have been rather successful. Although it wouldn't really go anywhere, it would just splash down onto the ground rather than just shoot from his hand. But it was a successful incantation nonetheless. And this would have also confirmed that Rudeus was not limited to just fire magic. As a matter of fact, he was curious as to whether he could unlock other forms of magic as well now. He would have done this 3 times before, exhausting his mana reserves for the day, at least when it came on to using water magic, and he would attempt to create water balls the next day, and move on to do it 6 times instead of just 3, unlike yesterday. From here on out, Rudeus would also learn how to increase his mana capacity. He would implement this with his innate fire abilities for the next couple of months. Though whenever he tried using the fire magic, he would do that outside, behind the house, for obvious reasons. I mean, he wasn't trying to burn the house down or anything. He would watch his father train his sword skills with the implementation of fire magic from time to time, and he would try to mimic his father. That would be the main way that Rudeus would end up learning how to harness fire magic. He wasn't able to get it all the way down, but he was able to recognize that he was improving somewhat. The sword movements, so they weren't even all there at all. You see, he seemed to have more an affinity towards learning magic than, sword skills. he wasn't really all that talented when it came on to using a sword, but when it came on to using magic, that was a whole nother story, and he actually really liked that. Rudeus would be found capable of creating fireballs, spikes, and small rudimentary constructs as well with his fire magic, and he was only doing this at the age of 2, for crying out loud. Although, of course, he had the mind of a 40-year-old. But any regular person would have been shocked to see what a 2-year-old was capable of doing. He didn't really have anyone to observe when it came on to his use of water magic though, which caused for that to be a bit of a slower process. He had a bit more of a learning curve to go through when it came on to water magic, because he had no real mentor at the time. Sure, he didn't really have much of a mentor for his ability to use fire magic, he didn't really have much of a mentor when it came on to using fire magic, but at the very least when it came on to fire magic, he had an example in the form of his father to, well, mimic. It was sort of like you watching a YouTube video, well, not a YouTube video, more so you simply go into a gym one day as a complete newbie and you don't know how to do any sort of workout at the gym at all, but you just look at some of the regular people at the gym and decide to mimic some of their actions, some of their movements, and that's how you learn from there. That's essentially what was really happening with Rudeus when it came on to him learning fire magic. When it came on to water magic, he would still try and push himself each day in order to improve the quality of his water magic, until one day, you see, he kinda accidentally made a hole in the wall while practicing in secret up inside the attic one day, and he would not be able to get away from this. Nah. You see, his parents would have immediately noticed this, and they would be surprised to see that Rudeus was capable of such a powerful magical attack at such a young age. For crying out loud, he was 2 years old, just barely learned how to walk. Physically speaking, at the very least, but, well, they didn't know what was happening inside Rudeus's mind. They didn't know about the true reality of things. Paul would immediately fly up to the attic while carrying Zenith, Rudeus's mother, in his arms. Rudeus would begin to panic, fearing the consequences of what was about to happen to him, but to his surprise, his father would laugh. Both of his parents would actually laugh and praise him for his grasp on magic so early on. His mother especially would show a desire to nurture his magical affinity and hire a tutor for the boy. His tutor's name would actually be Roxy, and Rudeus would immediately be infatuated with a woman. Unfortunately, the feelings weren't reciprocated, which that wasn't really much of a surprise for Rudeus, to be honest. He was 2 years old after all, or at least, once again, physically speaking, he was 2 years old. Roxy didn't seem all that enthusiastic when it came on to, well, having to train a 2-year-old, because in her mind, she felt as if it was literally just the parents overhyping yet another one of their kids, just because of the fact that they were able to cast one teensy weensy little spell, which may have been out of the norm for kids their age, but just because you could make a single droplet does not make you special in her eyes. That was just luck in her eyes. That was pretty much it. But Roxy would be proven wrong. For you see, Rudeus, wanting to wanting to impress his master, would cast a voiceless chant for a water ball attack in order to, well, demonstrate his, well, level of achievement so far. He wasn't sure if this was really going to impress her that much, but it was worth a shot. And Rudeus would question if she could also teach him a little bit about fire magic, which confused Roxy. There was no way that he could already use two elemental based forms of magic, right? Like, she literally just saw him make a voiceless chant. He made a silent incantation for, well, a water spell. The fact that he was even able to. The spell itself wasn't all that impressive. Well, it was for a 2-year-old. But what was even more impressive was the fact that this 2-year-old made a voiceless incantation, something that even she struggled with. And now he was asking about learning another form of magic, another form of elemental magic. Although, this one seemed fairly normal, you could say. Sure, he was part Lunarian and all, but full-blooded Lunarians usually began practicing fire magic around the age of 6 as their first form of magic. They were also meant to be incredibly proficient with it, but Rudeus, he was only half Lunarian, meaning that this didn't necessarily apply to him. For all she knew, him trying to learn from an early age might have just been him trying to get over the learning curve, trying to get an advantage over other Lunarian kids because of the fact that he was a half-breed, and there might be some issues later on with him trying to keep up with the other kids. She would find out soon enough. Well, no, she wouldn't. She would just assume that, and she would, of course, agree to teach him. This would have been after she regained her composure, after overthinking everything and imagining him being able to create voiceless incantations for both water magic and fire magic at the age of 2. Yeah, that was still something that she was having some trouble wrapping her mind around, but she would have to give the boy a response eventually. And she also needed to be a good example for the boy as well. Roxy would also explain that she wasn't the best at fire magic, so it would probably be in Rudeus's best interest to learn more from his father when it came on to that type of magic. She wasn't bad at using fire magic, but when it came on to people like Paul, who literally had an affinity for fire magic because of his race, him being an actual Lunarian and all, she had a feeling that he would probably be a better person to go to for learning such a form of magic. And Rudeus, he would pout. He didn't really like this answer since his father always refused to teach him how to use fire magic and how to fly, but maybe this time around things would change, especially after seeing what Rudeus was already capable of at such a young age. And she did mention that she would be willing to teach him fire magic anyways. It's just that she probably wasn't going to be able to teach him the more advanced techniques of fire magic. That's all. Which, it was better than nothing, he guessed. But having to go to his father to learn magic, and learn fire magic more specifically, was still something that he wasn't all that interested in doing yet. Over the next couple of years, Rudeus would end up learning more of the basics when it came on to water magic and fire magic as well. Roxy would be impressed with seeing how advanced Rudeus was getting already with fire magic. He was literally making full structures with his fire magic. At one point, she even saw him trying to create a dragon out of fire, for crying out loud. Even for a Lunarian, at such a young age, that was impressive. Rudeus would also train with his father in order to build up his sword skills. Rudeus would initially be overwhelmed by his father, but eventually Rudeus would be able to block some of his father's attacks. He was fairly average when it came on to swordplay, but he truly shined when he mixed his sword skills with magic. Paul would have eventually become willing to teach his son how to combine fire magic with swordsmanship, And Rudeus would have been a completely different beast when combining the two. At times, he was even able to overwhelm his father with his sheer speed, using his fire magic as both trajectory and a form of propeller. Those times would have usually been when he caught his father off guard with his initiative, though. It wasn't necessarily like, oh, Rudeus could go toe to toe with his father. That's absolutely not what I'm trying to say. By the time Rudeus was around the age of 5, he would have ended up mastering a Water Saint class spell, and he would even be given the title of a Water Saint by Roxy after accomplishing it. He would have became a Fire Saint. He would have became a Fire Saint mage or magician, whatever you want to call it, a month prior to gaining the title from his father. But with this newfound title of being a Water Saint, well, Rudeus would be in for a rude awakening the very next day. Roxy would explain that she had nothing else to teach, while Rudeus, considering the fact that he was now a Water Saint mage. He would be sad. He would be honestly really disheartened to find out that she was leaving. Rudeus had long passed her in terms of proficiency with fire magic as well, so any thoughts of teaching him that was out of the window as well. Rudeus wanted to spend more time with Roxy. He genuinely did because of the fact that she was the very first person who managed to convince him to go outside of his comfort zone. That, of course, being his house. He had reasons for being a shut-in for most of his former life, but they didn't necessarily apply to this world. He had to understand that. It just took an extra push from Roxy for him to get the journey into the great unknown that was this world, with Rudeus's newfound confidence, and thanks to the likes of Roxy, something that he would never forget. He would decide to venture outside of his house more often, eventually meeting a kid that sort of reminded him of himself. This kid, they had green hair, and they were being bullied by some of the other neighborhood kids for their appearance. And they accused him of being a superhero or whatever. Rudeus had heard the stories of these people before, but this person didn't match the description of one. These kids just wanted to be jerks since he had green hair. Rudeus would have understood that he had power here. Things, they weren't going to be the same as his old life. He was going to be a force of change in this world. He would demonstrate this by throwing water balls at the bullies. He would have tried to call out Rudeus for this, explaining that he should be on their side. This was a superhero after all. Or was he on the superhero side? They did recognize Rudeus's wings after all. Those black wings were usually related to the Lunarian race. Their parents had told them about how Lunarians could be sometimes. Although they were considered to be some of the best potential allies for an adventurer, there were also some Lunarians that viewed themselves as above any other race for their adaptability in any sort of environment. The kids figured that Rudeus was probably the latter, meaning that he needed to be humbled before he ended up getting his ego inflated during puberty or anything. They needed to pop that bubble before his bubble ended up going up to the sun, wanting to really test the pure durability that he had, and probably end up dying in the process. That was the story of some of the Lunarians. The fact that they would become so egotistical that they would even try and fly up to the sun, thinking that they would be able to survive up there, but they never did. There would also always be this one Lunarian that wanted to challenge their belief. that wanted to challenge those stories, wanting to be the best Lunarian, wanting to be the strongest Lunarian. Whoever could survive being in the sun would mean that they would probably become the king of Lunarians, for crying out loud. They would become the strongest Lunarian. That was how most of the stories went, but they always ended up in failure. They figured that this was going to be exactly what Rudeus was going to turn into unless they humble him immediately. And their form of humbling would of course be, well, trying to fight him. Yeah, I'm not even gonna cap. They would try to throw stones at the boy, but Rudeus, he would simply raise a hand, incinerating each of the rocks thrown at him. The villager boys would be surprised at his display of power. He already knew magic? And to such an extent? He didn't even make any sort of chant. That didn't make sense whatsoever to their minds. What kind of sorcery is this? Rudeus, he would have picked up a stick and he would have used it to deal with the boys, beating each of them in a quick succession. They would end up running away in fear from Rudeus crying, and Rudeus, he would just drop the stick afterwards, dusting his hands. And then he would turn to see the green-haired kid. He would want to see how they were doing by stretching out his hand towards them in order to help them up. They would be fearful at first, but Rudeus would give them a reassuring smile. At first, the kid thought that Rudeus was going to just beat them up like the other kids were. And the only reason why he got rid of the other kids was so that he could, beat him up as well. But they would end up taking Rudeus's hand and introduce themselves as Sylph. Sylph would explain that they had a bad rep for having green hair, which many usually related to the Superid race. Rudeus would call the other kids idiots for picking on them for simply that. It was out of their control. Sylph would even explain that they were mainly human and part elf. In Rudeus's mind, it would have been exciting to hear the part that, there were elves in this world. But Sylph would also explain that for some reason, although they were part of these two different races, neither one of their parents had green hair. Sylph was the only one who had green hair for some reason. They believed that it was some sort of recessive trait or whatever, and that there was something hidden that they just didn't know about. Maybe they kind of were part of the Superid race for all they knew. And they would actually begin to cry thinking about it. But Rudeus, they were trying to console, Sylph. They were trying to console Sylph in order to stop them from crying. Rudeus would also explain that he was a hybrid as well. They had something in common. You see, Rudeus was part Lunarian and part human. And when it came onto his skin tone, it was lighter than his father's own, but darker than his mother's. Although it wasn't necessarily a one-to-one comparison, it was something which Sylph would acknowledge and be appreciative of. The fact that Rudeus was trying to connect with them in such a way. From there, their friendship would actually begin to blossom. Rudeus would have used some of his water magic in order to clean up his newfound friend, and used some warm wind magic as well to dry them off. Sylph would question how Rudeus was able to do that, to which he explained that he had learned magic at an early age. If they learned the right incantations, you see, Sylph could probably do the same thing as Rudeus was just able to do. Sylph could probably learn how to use magic, and to the same degree as Rudeus one day. When it began to get dark, Rudeus, he would actually accompany Sylph on their way home before returning to his own home, where he would end up getting into an argument with his father. Apparently the kids who were bullying Sylph decided to snitch on Rudeus. And you want to know what is the most hateful part about about them snitching? It was the fact that they lied about what they did. They made up lies in order to put themselves in a good light. Rudeus would have eventually managed to get his father to listen to reason, though. Paul would have even apologized for merely jumping to conclusions like that rather than listen to both sides of the story. Rudeus would have accepted the apology before heading inside, and for the next 6 months, Rudeus would have grown closer with Sylph, eventually deciding to teach them magic. They had some run-ins with the neighborhood bullies from time to time, but they'd be able to deal with them easily. One of the mothers would just continue to complain about Rudeus's behavior, but Paul would have ended up getting annoyed with her persistent nagging, eventually having Rudeus explain himself in front of the woman. She would try to argue her case, but Rudeus, he will quickly shut her down. Any and all points that she may have had would have been shut down by Rudeus, causing her to realize that she just had a rotten child who needed to be disciplined. That was all. The neighborhood kids went about it too after that, and Rudeus, with this little bit of extra time on his hands now, would practice his way with the sword. He was still not nearly as skilled as his father when it came onto the way of the sword, but he was getting there. Somewhat. Rudeus would have also learned how to fly during this time as well. He would even teach silent incantations or silent spell casting, whatever you want to call it. It would have ended up raining one day though. The very same day that Sylph had learned how to use silent spell casting. They would retreat to Rudeus's place since it was the closest shelter at the time. And the family maid, Lilia, would have been waiting for Rudeus, though she wouldn't have been surprised to see he brought a friend home as well. She had always seen Rudeus as an abnormal child, but in bringing the friend home was probably one of the most normal things she had seen him do for a while. It was honestly believing in her mind. She would have explained that she drew a bath for the two and that they could later change into some dry clothing afterwards as well. She wasn't too concerned with Rudeus getting sick since he was a rather resistant fella due to his genetics, but there was still the off chance it could happen. Rudeus would have brought Sylph to his bathroom, in which he'd show no hesitation of getting undressed. Sylph, on the other hand, would be nervous. Rudeus wouldn't have realized until it was too late that Sylph wasn't actually a boy like he had once thought. Sylph would have freaked out and ran out to the bathroom crying. Rudeus would have been in a state of disbelief, and after a talk with his father, would do his best to apologize to Sylph. The next time he saw her, she would actually forgive Rudeus for his mistakes, and she would have also brought up her in once in order to, rekindle the relationship. Or, not really rekindle, more so have the relationship go back to the status quo and it not becoming awkward. She would have grown attached to Rudeus to a certain point over this time as well. Unfortunately, this wouldn't have been the end of Rudeus's troubles. During the winter, Rudeus would have found out that his mother was pregnant, which was a rather good thing. He was going to be an older brother. This would have been motivation for Rudeus to train even harder to become a strong big brother in order to protect his little brother or sister. It would have been a happy moment in his family. Until they found out that Lilia was pregnant as well. Of course, it would have been with Paul's child. Paul would have owned up to his mistakes, committing an act of infidelity, and falling into a state of lust while Zenith was pregnant. Rudeus found out that there was this strange taboo in this world when it came on to having relations while pregnant. He supposed that people thought it could harm the baby the woman was carrying. It was something that some people in his old world used to believe as well, but with advancements in medicine and technology, this belief would have faded over time. But with this world, they were living in medieval times, so you could kind of understand where they were coming from. But then again, the happy home that Rudeus had grown accustomed to had now just disappeared within a moment's notice. It was a cold and quiet environment instead now. Everything felt so somber, so sad, so unlively. It unnerved Rudeus. One night, Rudeus would have ended up eavesdropping on a conversation between his mother and Lilia. He would have listened to his mother's conversation, and during this conversation, he would end up hearing the maid's plans of apparently plan. Okay, Rudeus would have ended up hearing Lilia's plans of returning to her hometown. Of course, Zenith would actually refuse. And this, this plan of Lilia, explaining that she would have to have her baby here. Even though she didn't like the sort of situation that was happening right now, she still had a heart. She understood that sending her out in this sort of weather was pretty terrible. There was no way that she was just going to send a pregnant woman out into the cold abyss like that. She was not a cruel person at all. That's something that even Rudeus had to admit was true. Lilia, not wishing to be a burden towards the Great Rat family, would bring up how she supposed that she could leave after a baby was born. It would take a month's time in order to reach her hometown, and in this weather, it wasn't suitable for someone with a newborn child, even if that child was part Lunarian. It was something that was unseen in his mind, but she didn't know how to word it at first. And she was pretty stressed out about this whole situation as well. But Rudeus would have understood that he would have understood the situation as well. He would have understood that this was not an ideal situation whatsoever for anybody in this situation. But he had to step up in order to save Lilia, probably his favorite maid, one of his favorite people in this world so far, from suffering from a cruel fate. He appreciated Lilia's presence in his life after all. He didn't want to lose her, so he would end up throwing his father under the bus instead, in order to put Lilia in a better light. Zenith would eventually come to Rudeus' side, allowing Lilia to actually stay officially part of the family now. And by the time Rudeus' two siblings were born, he would realize that he hit a wall when it came on to what he could learn. This would have been further emphasized when he actually got a letter from Roxy, which would have been explaining her journey so far. She actually was now a Waters. I don't even know how to phrase it. Basically, what ended up happening when it came on to Roxy was that, simply put, she had gone up a level in terms of her water class, her water magician class. Rather than being a water saint, she was now a water king, I believe, was the term. Rudeus was still stuck at Saint class for both of his styles. Sure, he was talented in terms of magic, and he was okay in terms of sword skills as well, but he realized that if he was ever going to make some serious progress, he was going to have to attend some sort of institution where they had the people who could truly nurture his talents, his capabilities. As of now, the only form of magic that Rudeus was especially adept at was fire magic, since he had his father who could train him in terms of using fire magic. His dad did have decades more experience than Roxy in terms of how to use it after all. The way he learned how to combine fire magic with swordsmanship was effectively the only way that Rudeus could really even keep up with his father during the sparring sessions most of the time as well. It wouldn't be that easy to simply attend magical school though, since he had to also take into account Sylphiette's feelings as well. He didn't realize up until the moment he brought it up. Him leaving to attend Renoa Magical Academy, they realized how attached Sylphiette had become to him. Though his parents were able to afford to send Rudeus by himself to the academy, it was a bit over their budget in order to send him and Sylphiette to the academy as well. They had to account for their growing family after all, and Paul had already begun to work harder than usual in order to provide for the family. Rudeus would explain that if he had to, he would be willing to get a job in order to afford to get Sylphiette into the academy as well. Paul would have been surprised by Rudeus's determination and sighed with a smile on his face. The boy was stubborn. He really was his son, he had to admit. Paul would pull a couple of strings in order to help Rudeus out. And while practicing his sword skills one day, Rudeus and Paul would end up being interrupted by a wagon stopping by their house. A tall, muscular woman with a tail and cat-like ears would actually exit from out of the wagon, with Paul showing that he had some familiarity with a woman. So did Zenith actually. This would have been Rudeus' first time meeting this woman though, but he would have been amazed at what he was seeing. In his eyes, he was basically seeing what was practically a goddess. Lilia would have also came outside, mentioning something about how she was going to miss Rudeus. There were actually civil comments about this, which confused the boy. What did they mean by missing him? He wasn't going to go anywhere. What did... Paul would have been the bearer of bad news in this situation though, explaining that Rudeus would have to go away for a while if he wished to make enough money to pay for Sylphie's tuition one day. Before Rudeus could even say or do anything to escape from this situation, you see, Paul would hit a pressure point in between Rudeus's wings that would make him go limp. It was something that his father used to do to him when he was a kid as well, and he ended up learning how to do it during his travels. Rudeus would have been unconscious long enough to wake up inside of the wagon with Ghislaine. They would have been too far away at this point for Rudeus to simply fly away. He would curse his dad for that sneaky move that he used against him while his guard was down. Ghislaine would explain the situation to Rudeus, which was that they were going to be working together from now on. Rudeus would sigh hearing this. He would accept his fate, although he did not necessarily know what was going to be in store for him moving forward.
Rifty.